Book nibbles. Big ideas, small bites. Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance lies at the heart of Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson's book Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. It's an idea both simple and profoundly unsettling. When our actions and our beliefs clash, or when we hold two conflicting beliefs, the resulting discomfort, dissonance, drives us to rationalize, justify, and bend reality so we can see ourselves as competent, moral, and right. This impulse is so deeply woven into human psychology that it colors politics, personal relationships, criminal justice, science, history, and even our own daily choices. What the book does masterfully is walk readers through not only the mechanics of dissonance, but the striking, sometimes tragic, examples of how self-justification warps perception and leads people further down paths of folly, denial, and harm, all while convincing themselves that they are acting with integrity. The story begins with small choices. Imagine buying an expensive car after months of research. On the drive home, the new owner doesn't reflect on the possibility that they could have chosen poorly. Instead, they notice all the other models with flaws, the superior comfort of their own, the sleek lines that surely others admire. If the car later develops problems, it's easier to focus on how much better it is than some cheaper alternative or how it fits their lifestyle perfectly, rather than to admit the purchase was an expensive mistake. This is everyday dissonance reduction at work, the drive to see our decisions as wise. Now, expand that tendency into weightier matters like medicine, justice, politics, or war, and the stakes of self-justification become enormous. The book illustrates how this drive explains why people persist in irrational beliefs, even in the face of contrary evidence. The classic case comes from Festinger's own study of a doomsday cult in the 1950s. The cult believed aliens would rescue them before a cataclysmic flood. When the flood never came, one might expect them to abandon the prophecy. Instead, they doubled down, claiming their prayers had saved the world. Their belief was too entangled with their identity and sense of worth. Admitting they had been duped would mean admitting to foolishness, wasted time, lost family ties, and shattered meaning. It was easier to twist the evidence than face that. This is dissonance in its rawest form. When reality collides with conviction, conviction usually wins. In interpersonal contexts, the same mechanism drives endless cycles of misunderstanding. Take a marriage in which one partner snaps in anger. The person who lashes out rarely thinks, "I was cruel." Instead, they tell themselves, "I was provoked. I was tired." Anyone would react this way. Meanwhile, the partner on the receiving end thinks, "That was deliberate, unfair, and hurtful." Each person's self-justification deepens the rift. The angry partner sees themselves as reasonable under the circumstances, while the other sees only callousness. Multiply such interactions, and the marriage can corrode, with each side convinced of their own rightness. The book emphasizes that self-justification is not lying to others. It's lying to ourselves so convincingly that others see the results as arrogance, stubbornness, or malice. In politics, dissonance is magnified into public spectacle. When officials are confronted with evidence that a policy has failed, their instinct is not to acknowledge the error, but to reinterpret the outcome as success, or to insist that conditions would have been worse without the policy. The authors describe the Vietnam War as a glaring example. American leaders escalated the war despite mounting evidence that it was unwinnable. To admit futility would mean admitting the deaths of thousands of soldiers were in vain. So each new step deeper into the quagmire was framed as necessary to honor sacrifices already made. This sunk cost fallacy merges seamlessly with dissonance reduction. Having invested so much, leaders convince themselves that victory must be around the corner. Decades later, the echoes resounded in the Iraq War, where officials doubled down despite mounting contradictions between their rhetoric and reality on the ground. The lesson is sobering. Powerful leaders are not immune to dissonance. They may be more vulnerable because the stakes of admitting error are so high. Science, supposedly the bastion of self-correction, is not spared. Researchers, like all humans, can become invested in their theories and blind to disconfirming data. Famous cases include psychologists who clung to disproven ideas about memory or sociologists who ignored contradictory findings because reputations and careers were on the line. The book doesn't vilify scientists but shows that even in the most rational of fields, the need to be right distorts interpretation. One of the practical takeaways is the value of double-blind procedures, peer review, and replication, structures designed to counteract self-justification. Without them, the human tendency to favor confirming evidence would overwhelm the pursuit of truth. But some of the most wrenching chapters address the criminal justice system. Here, the cost of dissonance can be measured in lives destroyed. Police and prosecutors, once convinced of a suspect's guilt, become deeply resistant to contrary evidence. Even when DNA evidence later exonerates a prisoner, officials often insist the person is guilty anyway, weaving new explanations to preserve their original narrative. A detective might argue that the DNA evidence was contaminated or that the suspect had an accomplice, rather than admit the investigation went astray. Why? Because to acknowledge error would mean admitting that years of testimony, the suffering of families, and even one's own sense of being a protector of society were flawed. The authors recount cases where innocent people spent decades behind bars because officials could not confront their own mistakes. What outsiders call injustice, insiders experience as self-protection. It's not that they are intentionally cruel, but that their need to see themselves as fair and competent blinds them. The ripple effects reach into therapy and personal healing. People often resist acknowledging their own role in conflicts or their own biases. For instance, abusive parents may minimize their behavior by reframing it as discipline or love. Victims, too, sometimes internalize blame, telling themselves they deserved mistreatment, because believing otherwise would force them to confront the terrifying randomness of cruelty. In both directions, dissonance creates narratives that distort reality but soothe identity. Therapists who understand this dynamic can gently help clients untangle justifications, though the process is fraught because it means asking people to confront painful truths about themselves. The book also explores how memory is not a neutral recorder, but an accomplice in self-justification. Human memory reconstructs the past, smoothing contradictions to fit the present self-concept. If someone sees themselves as generous, they're more likely to recall instances when they gave but forget the times they were selfish. If a person prides themselves on honesty, they might remember exaggerations as jokes rather than lies. This malleability of memory ensures that self-justification has a built-in ally. Our minds literally reshape history to make us consistent. In relationships, this plays out as couples recalling different versions of the same fight, each memory aligned with self-protection. The danger is that over time, these rewoven memories harden into unshakable convictions, making reconciliation nearly impossible because each side's truth feels absolute. Another domain where dissonance thrives is prejudice. When people hold discriminatory views, they often justify them with selective reasoning. For example, an employer who refuses to hire women for certain jobs may claim it's about protecting them from stress or because customers prefer men, rather than admit to sexism. Once discriminatory policies are enacted, the very existence of those policies reinforces the prejudice. If women are excluded from leadership, the absence of women in leadership becomes evidence they're not suited for it. This self-fulfilling cycle shows how dissonance fuels systemic injustice. Once people commit to a biased action, they reshape their beliefs to defend it. The authors show how individuals and institutions alike perpetuate harm while believing themselves fair and reasonable. But dissonance is not always destructive. The same mechanism can drive growth and resilience. When people commit to a course of action, they often rise to meet it. A student who tells themselves they're hardworking may study harder to maintain that self-image. A parent who believes they are supportive may strive to be more present. In such cases, the need for consistency pushes behavior in positive directions. The challenge, the book suggests, is recognizing when self-justification blinds us versus when it motivates improvement. What makes the book compelling is the array of vivid examples. In one story, police coerce confessions from suspects who were later proven innocent. The officers were not cartoon villains, but ordinary people who became invested in their version of events. Once they had a suspect, every ambiguous clue was interpreted as confirming guilt. When the confessions turned out false, the officers could not simply say, "We were wrong." That would shatter their self-concept as protectors of justice. Instead, they doubled down, insisting the suspects must be guilty despite the evidence. To outside observers, this seems insane. But from the perspective of dissonance theory, it is tragically predictable. Another striking example involves therapists who recovered supposed repressed memories of abuse in patients. Many therapists truly believed in their methods, and when patients later accused family members of long-forgotten crimes, the therapists saw confirmation. When evidence showed those memories were false, some therapists refused to back down, insisting that denial by family members was proof of guilt. Again, admitting error would mean acknowledging they had implanted trauma and torn families apart. The cost to their self-image was too high, so self-justification prevailed, sometimes destroying lives. On a more everyday level, the book captures the little lies we tell ourselves to maintain coherence. A person who cuts in line tells themselves they're in a rush and it's no big deal. Someone who cheats on taxes rationalizes that everyone does it. A spouse who strays might claim they were driven to it by neglect. Each act requires a story that preserves the self as good. Rarely do people think, "I did this because I'm selfish or dishonest." Instead, the narrative protects the ego, even if it erodes integrity over time. The danger is that repeated justifications can escalate behavior. Once someone cheats a little and rationalizes it, the next step is easier. Small dissonances pave the way for bigger ones. The book is not purely fatalistic. Tavris and Aronson offer strategies for reducing the harm of self-justification. One key is cultivating humility, the ability to admit error without seeing it as a global indictment of the self. This requires reframing mistakes as opportunities to learn rather than threats to identity. Leaders who can say, "We miscalculated, and here's how we'll adjust," prevent escalation. Couples who can say, "I overreacted, I'm sorry," prevent bitterness. Institutions that build in mechanisms for accountability, like independent review boards, can course correct. The authors stress that it takes deliberate effort because the default human impulse is denial. But with awareness, dissonance can be managed rather than allowed to spiral. Another strategy is separating the act from the self. Instead of saying, "I am a bad person because I made a mistake," it helps to say, "I made a bad choice, but I can act differently next time." This subtle distinction prevents the ego from feeling annihilated by error. Parents can use this with children by criticizing actions rather than identity, which encourages growth without triggering defensiveness. In workplaces, leaders who emphasize learning from mistakes rather than punishing them create environments where people can confront dissonance honestly. The book also points out the value of dissent and dialogue. When people surround themselves with like-minded others, their justifications harden. But exposure to differing perspectives can puncture bubbles of certainty. This is why diverse teams often make better decisions. They bring competing narratives that challenge self-serving distortions. Of course, listening to dissent requires emotional resilience because it means tolerating discomfort. But without it, organizations and societies drift into groupthink, reinforcing errors rather than correcting them. Ultimately, the book's most unsettling message is that self-justification is not a quirk of others. It's in all of us. We are wired to defend our choices, to smooth over contradictions, to recall selectively, to insist on our virtue. Reading the examples of prosecutors, politicians, therapists, or spouses, it's tempting to think, "I would never do that." But that reaction itself is dissonance reduction at work. The humbling truth is that everyone justifies because everyone needs to maintain a coherent self. The challenge is not to eliminate dissonance. It cannot be eliminated, but to become aware of it, to slow down our rationalizations, and to leave room for the possibility that we might be wrong. The book ends with a call for compassion, both toward ourselves and others. Recognizing that everyone is trapped in self-justifying stories allows for empathy. Instead of seeing adversaries as liars or villains, we can understand them as people defending their own sense of worth. This doesn't excuse harm, but provides a path to dialogue. Likewise, forgiving ourselves for past mistakes requires acknowledging how self-justification shaped us without letting it define us. Growth begins when we admit not just that mistakes were made, but that we made them, and that we can choose differently. What makes mistakes were made, but not by me? So powerful is its blend of psychology, real-world examples, and practical wisdom. It shows that the need to justify ourselves is at once a source of resilience and destruction. It keeps us from collapsing under the weight of contradiction, but it also blinds us to truth. The book doesn't offer easy fixes because there are none. Instead, it offers clarity, a lens for seeing why people cling to false beliefs, why conflict persists, why institutions resist reform. And in that clarity lies the first step toward change. By becoming aware of our own self-justifications, by creating systems that check them, and by extending compassion to those caught in theirs, we can reduce harm. The phrase "mistakes were made" is the passive voice of denial. The authors invite us to take the active voice. "I made a mistake" is a small shift, but one that transforms dissonance into growth. And that's it. Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me, by Tavris, Ph.D. Thanks for listening to Book Nibbles. If you enjoyed this bite-sized book, don't forget to subscribe for more quick, insightful summaries. See you in the next nibble.